Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Steer Your Career podcast. On today's podcast, I have a LinkedIn expert, Beth Granger. She typically works with companies to help their sales team be better social sellers, with coaches to grow their business online, and with CEOs that are looking to establish their brand. But there's a lot of overlap with what job seekers need to understand about how to use the platform. And we'll talk about how Beth used some of her skills that she teaches people and some skills that we teach people at Academic Careers of how she proactively reached out to me and how we started to build a relationship. So I think you'll really enjoy this episode. Finally, before we dig into this one, if you are looking for a better job with confidence, accountability, support, a collaborative community, that's what we do best at Academic Careers. We offer two different programs, a personalized coaching program where we work with you until you get that better job, guaranteed. And we offer a group coaching program as well, which is shorter in nature, but you still get all the skills and all the frameworks, everything to help empower your job acquisition efforts. So check that out at academiccareers.com. Listen to this podcast. If you like it, rate, review. If you send me a screenshot, I'll give you a shout out sometime and maybe give you a LinkedIn profile review or something cool like that. So anyway, enjoy this episode with Beth and I. And the last three words I shall leave you with are own your career. Hello, and welcome to another amazing episode of the Steer Your Career podcast. Today, I have on the pod Beth Granger. Beth and I met on LinkedIn, and she actually proactively reached out to me. And we're going to talk a lot about LinkedIn on this episode, and we'll talk exactly how she reached out to me. But before we do that, I want to introduce Beth to the audience here. So Beth, tell the Steer Your Career audience a little bit about yourself.
Oh, how to condense a long history. So right now I am a trainer, consultant, and speaker, and all around having more effective conversations. So that could be LinkedIn, that could be in person, that could be anywhere. But I started my career as a graphic designer, and it has not been a straight career path. It's had turns and twists, and that's the best way.
Nice. And what you very eloquently sum up on your LinkedIn profile is accelerating your LinkedIn and networking learning curve. I'm sure you have other talents, but I know this is one of your big talents here. And going to that, I'd like to talk about our first interaction on LinkedIn, which occurred October of last year. And you basically said, nice to meet you in the comments. I think you were looking at something I commented on, or you and I were like interacting on a comment about something.
Yep.
And then you followed up, you interned at Paul Corporation, which I did. Small world. That was where I got laid off after 18 years and then started my business. So you connected with me on so many different fronts there. Like I have Paul Corporation, and in some place I interned when I was 15 years old. And also I've been laid off several times. I'm pretty outspoken about that. So you connected on all fronts. Love to hear how you did that. And I know this is a core aspect of what you do to really network and build
Yeah.
relationships online.
What's funny is most of the time, if there's somebody that I want to meet that I've strategically sought out, done a search for, then I'm going to try to get an introduction. That's always going to be first. But when you meet somebody in comments, because there's a conversation already happening, then it's a much easier outreach because you can comment on that conversation. And of course, I look at somebody's profile and see if there's anything else interesting. And in your case, I discovered, we had a common thing. So I did it manually. I did not use automation. I don't believe in using automation for that. Plus, it can get you kicked off the platform. I always think of it as if we were in person at some event and we started a conversation, it's just continuing that conversation.
Yeah. And I think that's a great analogy. It's just like a verbal conversation going online. There was like a door open because you and I were like commenting on the same post. And then you use that to say, hey, would love to connect. And then we've had conversations. Now you're on my podcast. And now I met another friend. And you did hopefully as well.
Absolutely.
You work, I think, with two different constituents, I believe, like people that are actually, you tell me, who are the type of individuals that you typically coach and help with leveraging LinkedIn?
There are a couple of different buckets. The first bucket is companies will have me come in and I work with their organization in different ways. It might be the sales team on how to use LinkedIn as part of their process. It might be marketing to develop content that the sales team can use. It might be the entire organization to be good advocates and spread the word about the good work that organization is doing. So that's one bucket. Bucket two would be individual business owners, coaches, speakers, less often job seekers, but sometimes. And when it is, it tends to be someone who is working but know they want to make a leap in the future. And then the third would be, I call it the personal training approach. It tends to be business owners, CEOs, former CEOs who want to engage on LinkedIn, but don't want to do something wrong and damage their reputation. So they want somebody alongside them as they're doing their activities. So those are pretty much the three, of course, and then just speaking separately.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. So LinkedIn is a huge platform, a billion users, and there's so many different use cases on there with the companies that you're working with to help their sales teams to be more effective with social selling, coaches and like solopreneurs, it sounds like trying to
Yep.
build their presence online so that they get more inbound and authority on the space. And then CEOs like on the personal branding side. And then I work typically with candidates that are looking to get a job. There are a lot of overlaps in the different areas of how you're trying to use LinkedIn. But what are some of the key tips that might be relevant for anybody in any of those buckets, and especially ones that would overlap with job seekers? And
Yeah.
frankly, anybody who is on LinkedIn is at one point in their career likely going to be looking for a job.
Yes. Yes. And or to start a business but it's work, meaningful
Yeah,
work.
sure. So if you're not running your own business and you're not successful there, and there are a lot of people that work for an employer,
Correct.
but there are similarities of how you use the platform. I love some of your top tips that you
Yeah.
generally advise people.
So my sort of overarching philosophy, if you're ever wondering, should I say that thing? Should I take that behavior? Imagine you were in a room full of people, maybe in a networking event or whatever. Would you say that thing to that person? Or would you take that behavior or would they turn around and walk away from you? So that's the overarching theme, right? If you're ever wondering. And because think about the weird behavior that you've seen or you've been the recipient of on LinkedIn. Somebody, the connect and pitch, for instance, right? People hate that. And the other thing is not to rush. You can't rush relationships. You also can't automate relationships, in my opinion. So it's the taking your time trying to get to know somebody and using it as a networking tool as well. If there's somebody you want to get to know or reach out to, is there somebody that already knows that person that can make an introduction for you?
Yeah, that's really true. And don't rush the relationship is so critical across all those different dimensions because you're meeting someone online. There's a little bit less, there's a lot less anonymity on LinkedIn than other platforms because generally they're real people because they have their real verified companies that they work for and they have a public persona at risk. But you and I'm looking back at our thread, started on October 23rd. We went back and forth like probably 12 conversations before finally I felt comfortable. Hey, Beth, let's get on a call together and let's chat. You could
Yep.
have done the same to me, but it looks like 12 back and forths where we're just doing small talk. And that's so critical in any relationship. And your goal with me or with other folks or anyone that is using a platform is generally eventually to move it from offline or from online to offline via like a video chat or something like that.
Yep.
Is that
Yep.
generally what outcome you're seeking?
Yeah, it depends. It's for me, it goes in both directions. If I meet somebody in person, LinkedIn is a great way to keep in touch with them because how many coffee meetings or Zoom meetings can you have in a week? And then if I meet somebody on the platform, sometimes, yes, I want it to go to a Zoom or a call or whatever. And then there are other times where it might not be, maybe we met and there just isn't any reason at this particular time to have a conversation. So I stay in touch by engaging with someone's content and then in the future, if there's a reason for it, then we jump on a call.
No, that's a fair point. Not everything needs to have offline conversation. You also talk, your LinkedIn profile is very well written, so kudos to you. You're obviously a trained professional in that. But in your about section, you have a quote saying, "Do you jump from networking event to networking event and yet you aren't getting any referrals?" So, that happens to a lot of people. I'm sure a lot of people are responding to you and saying, "Yes, I'm having this challenge." Where do you think people hit those walls? And then what advice do you have for people to hurdle those walls?
I think some of it is, so I'm very lucky. When I was let go from my job all those years ago, I told everyone I knew that I was looking for a new job. And a friend of mine said, "Come to my networking group." And I said, "What's a networking group?" So I was introduced to networking from a very special group of people that were not transactional. No one ever expected a referral or to give a referral. It was all about getting to know each other and supporting each other in different ways. And for instance, I might be able to give you a referral. You may never have one for me, but you'll invite me to an event. So there was that aspect of it, the where I learned to network in a very holistic way, if that's the right word. But I think some people go to events and make assumptions right away. Either these aren't the right people for me, they haven't even had a conversation with them, or they have one conversation and who knows who somebody's brother, sister, next door neighbor is. I think there's making the assumptions and also, again, trying to take things too quickly. Just because I met you at a Chamber of Commerce event doesn't mean I'm going to refer you in to my best client's company.
How do you build that rapport? And there's lots of good networking organizations. I don't know if you want to mention which networking group you were part
Sure,
of or ones that you
sure.
recommend in general. I think
Yeah,
there's lots of great ones. So
there are. And I don't think I think it really depends on the group of people. Doesn't matter what the name is of the organization. So there could be one where one group is amazing and one is not.
yeah,
The group that taught me to network is called ABA, American Business Associates, based here in New York.
cool. Yeah, I've heard of BN business
Mhm.
stands for,
Yep.
but there's Chief, there's all these
Yeah.
different organizations that just encourage the mingling and networking, which is critical. So
Pre-pandemic, I used to say any morning, any diner.
So, what are like, how do people at these events wind up like warming people up? What you did over the DM LinkedIn,
Yeah.
but what are some good tactics to move those relationships from a networking event to something where you can have a mutually beneficial relationship with someone?
So something that I didn't mention when I introduced myself is I'm something called an exactly what to say certified guide. And this is all about having more powerful critical conversations. And one of the sort of four pillars or four cornerstones of conversational excellence is that curiosity is the fuel for conversation, for great conversation. So have you ever been to a networking event where or have a one-to-one and that person's just talking about themselves and not asking you anything? Curiosity. Ask people questions, learn about them. That's the key thing.
So you're saying exactly what to say. There were like four things, I believe.
There are four cornerstones. Yes.
So you're talking about curiosity. What are the other three?
Oh, now I'm going to have
Oh,
suddenly I'm drawing a blank, but no, it's one that the worst time to think about what you're saying is right when you're saying it. The curiosity one, the person asking the questions controls the conversation,
interesting.
and that people do things for their own reasons. And this all makes sense, right? You hear it and you say, oh, yeah, that makes sense, of course. But when you break it down and get really into it, yeah, it's very powerful stuff.
And what are some tips and tricks that you advise some of your clients, some of the organizations you work with, of how to best utilize LinkedIn to build these relationships? Are there some action steps or tactics that you are some go-to ones?
I find that all the behaviors on LinkedIn apply offline as well. So, one would be support your referral partners, for instance, and the people that you're looking to grow a relationship with. And ways you can do that on LinkedIn would be engage with their content, make introductions for them, wish them a happy birthday. And that's the same offline as well as online.
I've heard numbers. I don't know exactly if this is true, that there's a very small percent of people that actually create content on LinkedIn. I think it's 10%, maybe 20% of people. Like it's not even that high. I think like 10%. If your tactic is to interact with people that are creating content, say that they're in the 90% of bucket that are not creating content,
Mhm.
what are some of the tips there to identify the right sort of people, reaching out to them, and building those relationships for people that you may want to talk to that are on LinkedIn, but just not active on LinkedIn?
Yeah. So then obviously you have to do something different. And there's a whole sort of spectrum of that. If you go to somebody's page and they don't have a picture and there's hardly any information, then LinkedIn might actually not be the place that you're going to try to meet them or have a conversation with them on. But
Mhm.
if they have a profile and it's pretty filled out and they just don't share content, other ways would be obviously through direct messages, but you have to be really careful because of all the bad behavior, the connect and pitch and that kind of thing. You have to really treat it like a real conversation in person.
When you find people that are not active on LinkedIn, and there's a bunch that are not, what are some other tactics that like that you suggest to reach out, build those relationships with people? Are there, I'm sure in-person events are
Yep,
great
they're
opportunities
great.
there. What
Yeah.
other avenues and recommendations you have?
Of course, trying to get an introduction. So if you're looking at someone and they're a second connection, that means there's at least one person in between who may or may not know them well enough to make that introduction. But an introduction is always going to be more powerful than trying to introduce yourself.
So finding someone that you're connected with that's a second degree connection, and maybe not being able to connect with them on LinkedIn, but find their email or get some sort of introduction off of the LinkedIn platform.
Yeah, getting introduced by the person that you both know.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
the best way.
Cool. As you're working with some of the different people that you work with, the constituents that you work with, the companies like the salespeople, the coaches, the CEOs, are there different tactics that those different groups need to do, or is it pretty similar of how you instruct and advise of?
It really depends on what somebody's goal for being there is. Some people just want to share content and be known by their network and stay in front of them just so they don't forget about them. Some people are going to be more active and finding people, connecting with people, having conversations. It really depends on how you want to use the platform. So, yes, there are different strategies depending on what your goal is.
What's your goal on LinkedIn? Like, I know you and I both spend a lot of time. I don't know how much you do. I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn. I'm trying to reduce my utilization, but it's addicting.
It is.
What are your goals on LinkedIn?
Oh. So I have so many. For me, it's the online version of the in person networking that I do. So everything that comes from that, it's maintaining relationships, meeting new people, staying in front of my network so they know what I'm up to, so they can introduce me to people. It's really just a great 24/7 networking event.
How much time do you find yourself on there during a week or in a whatever time period?
How some people always have their email open, I always have LinkedIn open. So the actual time, honestly, I really don't even know. It's just there. And do I check it multiple times a day? Yes, of course I do. And in terms of the time it takes to engage with people, what I like to tell people is it shouldn't feel overwhelming. My role is so much that I'm there a lot. But for someone whose role is something completely different, you can make an impact in, say, 10 minutes a day, 20 minutes occasionally. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think you and I are super users. We're probably on the edge case. I have multiple tabs open all day and on my phone, on all over the place.
Yeah.
But for most people, I think it's more of a use it in a limited basis when it's your advantage. Most people, like job seekers that I work with and advise, I generally tell them not to focus on posting, not to spend so much time on comments, but rather be more targeted of finding the individuals at the organizations that they want to talk to. Then they can go into their posts and they can go into their profile and try to see if that individual is posting on LinkedIn, and then you can start
Yep.
engaging with them before you reach out. Or you can just send a connection request with some sort of commonality, like you did to start the
Yep.
conversation of saying, hey, we both worked at Paul Corporation nearly two, well, for me, it's like 3 or 4 decades ago. For you, I think it was 18 years ago, but still, that is an uncommon commonality. I don't know how many
Yep.
people have worked at Paul Corporation.
It's a global company. Could happen.
It is. Said, hey, you're a New Yorker. I'm a New Yorker too. That's so cool. I'd be like, that's a little
Yeah.
less
Yeah.
like common. Yeah. So you work with a lot of clients that are not comfortable on LinkedIn,
Yep.
not comfortable with what they're posting. And what are some common missteps that you see or concerns that you see with clients and individuals of their utilization and leveraging of LinkedIn?
Yeah. It's really fascinating, actually. I think it's not necessarily the most intuitive platform. They change things a lot, but don't tell you, which is great for my business, but frustrating for users. And some of it comes from just not understanding the behavior or the etiquette or what actually happens on the platform. For instance, a lot of people think when they do a post that every single one of their connections is going to see it. that it somehow magically gets to all of them. And that's not the case. It goes in the feed to a certain percent of your network, whether they see it or not, you don't know yet. I think that there's some of that. And so people will dwell on every word of a post and just they want to get it perfect and what percent of their network is going to see it. Or because they assume people see everything, they want to do a series without saying, hey, this is the second in a series, or kind of framing it. And then the other thing is people often are looking for shortcuts that either don't exist or shouldn't be taken. Like someone will say, I can get you 100 new leads on LinkedIn a day. And just by using this great automated tool, people don't realize that tool is not approved by LinkedIn and can get your account shut down.
Yeah, I've toyed with some automation and it was not a good, pleasant experience. When you work with people, what are some things that they're typically doing wrong? Most people are not using the automated software.
No.
Most people don't even know what they would use the automated software for.
Yeah.
Like I used it for marketing purposes and it did not work as intended and it was not authentic to your point. And it was, yeah. And I found out after because the company told me they were within LinkedIn's policy, but I found out later from a friend within LinkedIn that it wasn't. So I'm no longer using that. But that's not the typical challenge that people are having. What are some of the typical challenges of people having that they're coming to you because they're not leveraging LinkedIn?
Yeah.
What are some of those gaps that they're having? What are some common missteps?
Often it's really just that they don't know how to use it strategically. So they'll log in, they'll go to the homepage, they'll read some posts in the feed, but they won't know based on whatever their goal is, what should I be doing? Should I be looking for people? They just don't even know what you can do there. Some people assume, for instance, that it's only for job seekers. Oh, I'm not looking for a job. I don't need to be there. What I like to look at is what are your goals and what should you be doing every day? For some people, ignore the feed. That's going to draw you into a rabbit hole and you're not going to come out for an hour because you're reading posts, but maybe you should be clicking on the bell of the top 10 people you want to engage with and just engage with their content and don't read the content in the feed.
Yeah. And starting with that goal in mind is so critical. So I work with a lot of clients that are trying to get a job.
Yep.
I generally advise them don't look at the feed. Look to figure out who you want to connect with. Figure out the companies that you want to work at. Find commonalities. Someone who worked at
Yep.
Paul Corporation that now works at Google or whatever,
Right.
which was
Yep.
me at some point in my career. I'm not at Google anymore. But anyone who reaches out to me and says I worked at Paul Corp, that would get a response because I actually have fairly fond memories from $15 an hour as a 15-year-old. So I was pretty happy there for 16-year-old. But I generally tell people just be proactive on the site. Don't get sucked in as you're talking about. Find the people that you want to connect with. Reach out in a polite, respectful way. Also something that leverages some commonality, ideally works really well. Whether, and build the relationships that way. And don't get deterred when you don't get responses. So I'm sure you reach out to a lot of people. Like I wasn't the only person you DM that day, I'm sure. How do you deal with the lack of response? I'm sure there's a lot of your outreach that you've done to people that you don't get responses from.
I just don't worry about it. I move on. And there are also the things that where you're planting seeds that you don't even realize. So for instance, before I started my business, I thought I was looking for a new job. Saw one listed, thought I found the hiring manager, looked at her profile. The next day, she looked at my profile. Because we were in a group together at the time, you could message somebody. I asked her for an information interview. I didn't say, hey, are you the hiring manager? We had an amazing phone call. Turns out she wasn't the hiring manager. We have stayed in touch all these years, met for lunch. She actually hired me to speak at an organization. It's just, you don't know what these relationships will do when you start them. And to not be afraid to reach out. What's the worst that can happen? Somebody can say no or not respond.
Oh, and that's actually an interesting thing you brought up, that you used to be able to connect, message people that were in a common group. You no longer can. LinkedIn has stopped that, which is frustrating for people that want to connect with people through that. But there are ways that individuals can set their settings so that they accept all incoming DMs.
Correct.
And is that something you generally advise for people to do, or does that cause too much?
So it can. It really depends. So I have mine set that way. Do I get a lot of people trying to sell me franchises, lead generation, whatever? Yes, but it doesn't bother me. I just either delete it or send it to the other folder. It really depends on what you're open to. I like to make it as easy as possible for people to reach out to me, knowing that I'm going to have to deal with the additional spam.
I do that as well. I generally advise people to do that while they're actively in the job search and deal with but beware that you do get some crap
Yep,
and some of it. Yeah, you get a lot of snake oil.
absolutely.
Are there other tips that you have for individuals that are trying to maybe have a more targeted approach? So rather than going in their feed and looking for something, whether it's a salesperson, whether it is a CEO, whether it's coaches, how can people get more proactive on the platform rather than wait for things to come into their feed?
So, something I was talking about recently with a client, and I think it's a great thing to do that people don't realize. As part of what you do, whether you're in sales, whether you're looking for a job, whatever, you're out in the world and you're going to some event. There's a big event coming up, trade show, whatever it might be. If it's promoted and there are speakers and it lists, maybe it's a nonprofit and it lists the people who are going to be there or the board or whatever, you can reach out ahead of the event and say, hey, I see you're going to be speaking at, or I see you're going to be at the XYZ event. I'm going to be there also. I look forward to meeting with you. So you can make it more comfortable to walk into a room where you might not know people because you've already reached out.
That's awesome. I use that trick as well, and I probably don't share that as much. Not only like the speakers, and usually speakers are more senior in the organization and the company, and they're out there. They want to meet people too. They're doing this for
Yeah.
their career to get out there. And another thing is sometimes with these events, if they provide the list of the individuals, I always look at, depending on how big the list is, but I look at the list and I'll click on every LinkedIn profile. Some of the orgs are good with collecting and sharing those LinkedIn
Yeah.
profiles. And if the person looks interesting, I'll say, hey, I see you're also going to the CSEA event. That's a event for MBAs. I'm also going there. Love to connect with you. And
Yeah.
I would just go down the list and connect with a bunch of people that seem to be interesting people that I might be able to meet at the conference.
And the opposite is true too. You're sitting next to somebody at a session and connect with them, and then you can continue that conversation on LinkedIn.
Yes. And at conferences, I'm a big fan of the QR code,
Yep.
using the QR code on
I love it.
LinkedIn. It's hard for people to find. You got to click on the search bar and then you got to click on the QR code. And hopefully someone in LinkedIn is listening to this and will change the UI to make it a little bit easier for people to find. But that's another good thing where people can scan your QR code and connect with you
Yeah.
automatically. Cool, Beth. This has been a fantastic conversation. Last two questions I always like to ask our guests, and I know you've dropped lots of great insights here, is what is one last piece of sick career advice you'd like to leave our audience with?
Don't be afraid to take on a project that you think has nothing to do with what you do, because sometimes that leads to what you do next.
That is true. It's happened to me. So that's some great advice. Then finally, how can people find you and reach out to you?
Of course, I'm on LinkedIn and it's Beth Granger, Granger. I do have a website, bethgranger.com, but I'm hanging out on LinkedIn. So happy to chat there.
Awesome. Thanks so much for reaching out to me. I'm glad we've chatted, and
Yeah.
I
Thank
appreciate
you.
your work and posts on LinkedIn, and we'll continue to follow you there.
Thank you.
Thanks, Beth.